So this started after I had gotten back from Key West in the mid-90s and was lamenting to a friend in Kansas City, of all places, I wish we had like a Hemingway house here. And that's when he said to me, well, you know, Jack Kerouac, the writer, lived in Orlando, or maybe he died there or something like that. And I thought, okay, this would be, as a journalist, an interesting sort of search to see how much of that was true and what I could find out. And fortunately, Kerouac's first book of letters, this book had just come out. And the last few are dated December of 1956 from 1219 Yates Avenue here in Orlando, just a couple of blocks away in College Park. And so I knocked on the door there just out of nowhere, and a nice old lady kind of looks at me like, what is this guy doing here? And I said, I was looking to see, did you know the writer Jack Kerouac stayed in your house for a while? And she goes, oh, you know, I had some people from Rollins College come by here, and they told me about some writer who had stayed here for a while, a real wild man. I'm like, okay, yeah, that's Kerouac. And I said, well, do you know where he stayed after he left your house? Because he was only there to visit his sister, who lived there in the Yates house. And she goes, I'd heard it's around here somewhere in the neighborhood, like an apartment just a couple of blocks away. So 4 weeks after that, this is going to be 30 years ago, spring of 96, was looking for it, couldn't find anything. So failing that, I called up Kerouac's brother-in-law, who was listed in the Lowell, Massachusetts phone book, 2 Stevens Street, to be precise. And I asked him, do you know where Kerouac was living? It would have been in 57. And he goes, oh, okay, I've got a list right here on the wall of every place he ever lived. So summer of 57, that's going to be 1418 and a half Cloyser Street. That was the first impression of anything of the importance of this house. That's how it began. So let's take a look back here for a second. So I came up to what was 1418 and a half Cloyser. The address was right here, 1418, and it actually had the 1/2 part. And as I got to the door here, it was actually open, and there were squirrels running in and out. This backyard was covered in AstroTurf, and there was bric-a-brac all over here, and it was hard to believe that this would have been such a potentially historic place. So I knocked on the door, and this older couple invited me in, and they started telling me the story about it. Carol and John Ney, who were retired antiques dealers. At the time, this back porch apartment was not connected to the rest of the house, and it was covered in brown paneling, so it was very dark. And where John was sitting in the foyer here, there was so much stuff, I didn't even know the bedroom existed to begin with. So I sat in a little corner there, and literally there are roaches in there. But Carol, who's sitting on an L-shaped divan with her gray hair pulled back and this long brown cigarette, starts to tell me that her neighbor, who lived across the street, Rose McCrae, got to meet Kerouac. And she said he was in a lounge chair out here sunbathing after writing all night. And Rose went over and met him and said, introduced herself. And he said he had just finished this rock and roll book. And when it came out, he'd send her a copy. And then as Carol and I are visiting, she goes, would you like to see it? And I'm like, see what? And from out of this hidden space, she pulls a cellophane bag, and inside it is a first edition of On the Road. And I open it up, and it is signed to my good neighbor, Mrs. McCrae, Jack Kerouac. So that's confirmation. That was everything, to know that he was here. But more so than that this little time where he lived in this back porch apartment was where he made the transition from this nomadic nobody from Lowell, Massachusetts, twice divorced, mid-30s, to the Bard of the Beat generation. because while he was living here, he goes up to visit Joyce Johnson, who was his 21-year-old girlfriend at the time. On the Road comes out in September of 57. And of course, the Milstein Review in the New York Times, it's not a review, it's a coronation. And he's now the king of the Beat generation, just as if Hemingway was the avatar of the Lost generation. And all of a sudden, people are calling, wanting interviews, all of that. So by the time he gets back to this little back porch apartment and starts working again on a little typewriter that he was actually renting, he was still renting a typewriter when he was working here. And he started writing letters. And of course, he did the follow-up, the Dharma Bums here in 11 Days and Nights in November and December of 1957. And I would say also that this is the last place where he was prolific. This was his last prolific period as he was living here before he moved out a relatively short time later in April of 1958. And the great American photographer Robert Frank came, stayed with him, took some very important pictures of Kerouac, and then they loaded up in Frank's station wagon, and he was off to the next place in New York State. But in a nutshell, that's the historic relevance of this little place is he came here, this nomadic nobody, twice divorced from Lowell, Massachusetts, and left the so-called bard of the Beat generation. That's the historic import of this house. And of course, the legacy has been for more than 25 years now that it's also a writer's retreat. And others come here to ply their trade and pursue their passions, as Jack Kerouac did back in the day when he was living here on air condition. You can imagine how miserable it was to be here. He talked about taking a dozen cold baths a day, sweating and dying because it was so difficult in the heat. But history was made here, Kerouac's history. After the discovery of the importance of the house, given Kerouac's legacy, what I did was pitch an article to the Orlando Sentinel to commemorate what would have been Kerouac's 75th birthday. And back then, they had a wonderful Florida insert called Florida Magazine. And they let a TV guy write a 4,000-word article called The Road to Kerouac. This came out in 1997, a full year after I'd done the original research and came here for the first time. And because of the generosity of Kerouac's brother-in-law, John Sampas, he also let me go to the Berg Collection in New York City and do research on Kerouac's personal journals and his travels. And really, this is where he wrote his books, was in these notebooks. And also, there's a photograph here of Carol Ney with that first edition of On the Road that she had mentioned, and just tying it all up, and to be able to say, this little rental house in College Park was very historic. And after this article came out, several people in College Park came forward with the idea of saving this house, buying it, and preserving it as a writer's retreat. And thanks to the generosity of people like Jeffrey Cole, of the Darden Foundation, of the Grace Anderson Foundation, people like Summer Rodman and Dr. Bruce Gordy, and several other original members. Grace Hagedorn was wonderful in giving her time. Putting the Kerouac Project board together in 1999, we put our shingle out and started taking applications in the year 1999. And Aaron West was our very first writer in residence back then. And it's a wonderful thing to see that part of Kerouac's legacy endures today. I remember asking David Amra, what do you think Jack would think of this way to pay tribute to his legacy? And without pausing a beat, he said he'd cry. So, just knowing that there's that validation from David, who knew Kerouac and was always wanting to emphasize the angel side of Kerouac and the beats. that meant a lot as well. And he was one of our great early supporters also, David Amram. So that's the origin story of the Kerouac house, how it came to be, its historic input. And it's wonderful that now the house where he died in St. Petersburg has also seen a lot of attention and preservation, and that's great. But this is the original historic home in Florida, without a doubt. And again, because he made the transition from this nomadic nobody to the bard of the Beat generation. And right here in this space, in that bedroom where you see the pictures, without question, this was his last prolific period as a writer in Orlando at the end of 57. And then he moved out not too long into 1958. And he came back to Orlando to Kingswood Manor in 61 and 62 and actually owned a house there and wrote Big Sur. So thanks for your attention. It was a lot of fun to relive this.